Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Right, okay. So a very warm welcome to the translation seminar here at the Baptist University. Today we are very pleased to have two speakers, Ms. Grace Leung and Professor Mark Shuttleworth. They're going to talk about a very interesting topic, COVID-19 and metaphor, a bilingual study of pandemic metaphor in Hong Kong public discourse. Let me first very briefly introduce the two speakers. First, Ms. Grace Leung, graduating with a BA in Translation, Interpreting, and Intercultural Studies. Grace Leung has been research assistant at the Center for Translation, Hong Kong Baptist University since September 2019. Prior to the current project on metaphor studies, she assisted in a UGC-funded project centering on anthologies of translated Hong Kong literature. She is currently applied for research graduate degrees. Professor Mark Shuttleworth has been involved in translation studies, research, and teaching since 1993 at the University of Leeds, Imperial College London, University College London, and most recently here at Hong Kong Baptist University, where he's a member of the Department of Translation, Interpreting, and Intercultural Studies. He has a long-standing interest in metaphor and has published a number of articles on the subject. So without further ado, I give you Professor Shuttleworth and Ms. Grace Leung.
Thank you very much, White Ping. And I think I'm going to stand. Just put that there. So thank you everyone for coming. Warm welcome whether you're attending in person, and it's great to have a live audience, and whether you're attending via the Zoom meeting, and I think we have quite a number of people there this evening. So thank you very much for coming. We've been greatly looking forward to giving this presentation, which is on the topic of the metaphors of COVID-19 that can be observed in public discourse in Hong Kong, both in English and Chinese. So, without further ado, this is what we're planning to cover, and I'm going to be doing the first few introductory sections, and after that I'm going to be handing over to Grace, who's going to be delivering the meat of the presentation. After all, this is Grace's research, and it's only right she should present that herself. I'll start by giving a little bit of background about the project. So the project has been funded by the Hong Kong government. Their job creation scheme under Anti-Epidemic Fund 2.0. The project's title is Investigating Coronavirus Metaphors as Reflected in English and Chinese in Hong Kong. And we're not just to avoid any possible expectations not being met. We're not talking about translation. We're looking at separately at English and Chinese discourse. So just to make that clear right from the start. The project was launched in January 2021, and it's going to be running until January 2022. So this is, I guess, one of the main planned outputs from the project. So a quick overview of the COVID-19 epidemic in Hong Kong. Now, obviously, I'm not quite sure who our audience are, but I know that quite a number of you will have been in the city for some or all of the COVID-19 crisis. So, of course, Hong Kong was one of the first cities to have been struck by this new virus, and it was assaulted in the earlier part of 2020. We had the first reported case on the 23rd of January. And note that word assaulted that I used. That is a military warlike metaphor. And Grace is going to be talking about those a little bit later on. And if you look at the graph, that will be familiar to all of you, of course. That shows the three major waves, another metaphor, that have afflicted the city since then. You know, we are currently enjoying a period of calm, and of course, long may that continue. But that's not the case in other parts of the world at the moment, as we all know very well. Moving on, in a sense, I don't really need to talk about the characteristics of the epidemic because we've all been experiencing it. We know what it's like to live sometimes in, you know, very strict lockdown, or certainly with certain restrictions in place, and we've been met with this strange, frightening, unfamiliar situation suddenly come upon us. It's become, I'm afraid, our everyday reality. So we're all quite familiar with it now, and we've become. Many of us have become, or most of us have become, pretty knowledgeable about epidemics, about epidemiology, about how infection works, and about what the possible ways are that the epidemic is going to play itself out, as hopefully it will before too long. And we've been impacted. The society as a whole has been impacted, and we've also been impacted, some slightly, some very seriously, of course, on a personal level. COVID-19 elicits strong emotions of fear, for example, anxiety, in the case of some, sadly, of grief as well. What we're looking at is how this situation has impacted public discourse. And of course, it's a two-way relationship, because public discourse, and as you see, we're going to be focusing on media, scientific discourse, political discourse, and literature, plays its role in impacting the way we see and understand the virus, the epidemic, and so on. Okay, now, just as a very quick introduction, a little bit about metaphor, and Grace is going to be talking in greater detail shortly about the research methodology and so on that she's been applying. But just very quickly, what is our understanding of metaphor? And I think a lot of people, when they hear the word metaphor, they will think, oh yes, that's a literary phenomenon. And metaphor is used to create an image in people's minds. It's used as almost as a symbol, very often, that kind of idea. And of course, all that is true. But modern research indicates that metaphor, in fact, pervades all types of discourse, with, in fact, very few exceptions. The discourse of children is generally thought to be one of the main exceptions to this. But for adult discourse, wherever you look, you will find metaphor, and it plays a very significant role in helping us to shape, or helping shape our understanding of concepts, of events, and of major happenings like this pandemic that's upon us at the moment. And the way it does this is by enabling us to think of one thing as if it was something else, as if it were another thing, or one concept as if it were another concept. It enables us to model one concept or one conceptual area or conceptual domain in terms of another. It allows us to map, to use one of the standard terms, it allows us to map the language and the expressions, the ideas and the concepts which are typically associated with one conceptual domain onto the way we talk about and think about the phenomena within another conceptual domain. So if we go back to that metaphor that I quite obviously deliberately planted into what I was saying a few minutes ago, assaulted, we have been assaulted. The spread of the virus is being spoken of as if it was a military attack, or at least a physical attack. And what Grace will show with her examples later on is that this is reflected in a large number of different metaphorical expressions. And if you take them all together, which is what Grace has done, the sum result is that you can talk in general terms of the pandemic, the epidemic being spoken of as if it were war. But anyway, sorry, I'm stealing your thunder. I'll leave you to talk about that in greater detail. Got a bit carried away there. But, just to finish off this slide, people often think that the point of metaphor is to obscure. Oh, you're talking in metaphors. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course, that can be true, but more often than not, metaphor is used to make things clear. And very often we find that complex concepts are spoken about as if they were the simpler concepts, or the abstract is spoken of in concrete terms, and so on. And that helps us to understand the more complex, the more abstract, but also provides a definite framework in terms of our understanding, possibly in terms of the narratives that it suggests or as it plays into, and so on. So that metaphor can also have a strong persuasive power. Now, Grace has a large number of examples later on, but let me just content myself with one. Here we see that these two young people are they're being instructed in how to protect themselves from the virus, from the epidemic, and they're being referred to as young warriors, and they're combating the epidemic. And as you see, that in this case, the metaphor is partly visual. So the picture there, they're using their masks as shields and their sanitizers as weapons. So that's a particularly graphic example of what Grace is now going to talk to, because at this point I'm going to sit down and hand over to you, Grace. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for setting the scene and giving us the fundamentals to move on to the next part. So now I will talk about the methodology of our project. In our methodology, there are three pillars. First of all, we have to identify the metaphor, and second, we have to apply some parameters. And the third point is that we have to analyze the textual patterns within the text. So for the first point, metaphor identification, we have used a procedure called MIP. MIP is actually short for Metaphor Identification Procedure, and it is proposed by the Prigogis group in 2007. In their approach, if a lexical unit usage contrasts with a more basic contemporary meaning, the expression would be considered as metaphorical. So how do we determine whether the meaning is more basic? It would have to be related to bodily actions, and it should be more concrete and concise. And in some cases, maybe they are historically older. To distinguish the basic meaning, we have used two dictionaries, one in Chinese and one in English, because we have decided to build a bilingual database, and we'll talk more about it later on in the data collection section. And you can see that in 1B here, we have another thing called MIPFU. As the name might have suggested, it is actually an extended version of MIP, and it is an updated procedure of MIP developed by VU Amsterdam. They have clarified some points about MIP and added a list of metaphor categories, which include direct metaphor, indirect metaphor, implicit metaphor, and so on. And it might sound a bit overwhelming right now, but I will get more into that later on in the examples. And these categories are actually quite useful in combination with parameters, which is the next point I would like to talk about. So after we have all the metaphors identified, we have to apply some kind of parameter for the corpus analysis. Actually, in our project, we have used more than just one parameter, but here in the presentation, we're focusing on mapping. So what is mapping? Maybe Mark has just talked a bit about that as well, but let me explain it a bit more. It is actually the content of the metaphor. So in our project, we have adopted Steen's five-step method, which is the most well-known procedure for working from linguistic metaphor to conceptual metaphors. And it involves propositional analysis, which put forward a more systematic framework for us to identify the mappings aside from intuition. With a combination of parameters and metaphor categories, we can uncover general patterns in the meaning of the metaphors, the semantic domains, as well as the form of linguistic metaphors. So let's move on to the third pillar. The third pillar I would like to talk about is the textual patterning analysis. It is actually compiled by Dorst with reference to previous literature. So when we have the metaphor patterns, it can actually reveal the rhetorical goals of the text, and it can have a specific communicative impact on readers. In this project, the tool has been employed to explain the use of metaphor across different texts and different languages. For different languages, it actually means just Chinese and English. But let me just elaborate more on the data collection. So after introducing our methodology, we can now move on to how we collect the data and compile a corpus of over 600 metaphorical expressions. As the aim of the project is to look at how the epidemic has been conceptualized in Hong Kong, we have collected some publications on the COVID-19 epidemic. Because, as you might know, that the official languages in Hong Kong are at the moment Chinese and English. So we have decided to build a bilingual database, hopefully to identify whether there are any differences between the metaphors and the two languages. In terms of the genre, there are 4 text types that are included in our data collection. They are newspaper articles, government reports, scientific research paper, and literary text. The scope of the data also serves as a basis of cross-genre comparison. So initially, we have also included healthcare publication when we were looking for the suitable text, but it turns out that it didn't yield as many metaphorical expressions as we had expected. So we have decided to take it out from our data search. So by then, we have compiled a database that is comprised of 248 documents. We started to identify the metaphors using MIP and MIPFU, the procedures we just talked about. And we have selected the text with over 10 COVID-related metaphorical expressions. At the end of the data collection stage, a total of 44 bilingual texts has been selected for further analysis. And I should also mention that initially the number of texts in 4 genres was approximately the same. But after filtering the text according to our criterion, there are 2 text types that stands out among the 4. They are government reports and newspaper articles, which account for the highest number of documents included in the final corpus. And these three publications actually shows the highest level of metaphoricity in our database. And in fact, the number you see here are exclusive to COVID-19. The metaphorical expressions related to COVID-19. As Mark just told us, there are actually many more general metaphor-related words that pervade our everyday language. But for the objective of our project, we have screened those instances out and leave only the relevant meta specifically for the analysis. As you may have noticed, the top 3 metaphor-rich texts in the database are all from the press, which may suggest a certain communicative pattern in this type of text in comparison to other texts. And now we can move on to mappings. For the categorization tool, we recruited the parameter of mappings. It demonstrates what kind of content is entailed in the metaphorical expression, and it allows us to look at the data from a macro level. So here is an example that I've come across in one of the texts in the data search stage. So it is not exactly related to COVID-19, and I'm just showing it to demonstrate what we in this project mean by mapping. And in some other metaphor study literature, it is also called conceptual metaphors. According to COVID-Chesh, it is a systematic set of correspondences between 2 domains of experience. Certain elements and relations are mapped from one domain to another domain, from the target domain to the source, from the source domain to the target domain. Here in this example, with the verb spark, the concept of fire is mapped onto the concept of fury, and we can come up with a mapping. Fire as fury. Within the mappings, we can also see a kind of resemblance between the source and the target domains, and it unveils the conceptual structures of metaphors. These generalization of linguistic metaphors provide insights to a vast amount of text in our database. So let's move on to the statistics. First of all, this is an overview of the metaphor themes. During the categorization process, we noticed that certain themes stood out in our data set, and we've grouped them together and assigned different colors for those themes. As you can see in this table, military metaphor appears like the most often in the database with 91 occurrences. And it encompasses all the mappings related to the military aspect, including war, army and enemy, etc. And green is the color we assign to the mapping of this theme. As Mark has just suggested, military metaphor is the most prevalent theme that we can find in this type of text. And the second one, in the second place is language-themed metaphors. The source domains are usually related to language and code. This type of metaphorical expressions is mainly used when the authors would like to explain how genetic works. So when we compare the figures, we can see that the number of military-themed metaphor is the double of the second one, language-themed metaphor, is 91 and 46. It also confirms that the huge difference also confirms that the pandemic is often conceptualized as a war across different text types, and it is the most prevalent theme. And the third place is what we call natural world metaphors. And it is concerned with metaphors related to the nature. As Mark just introduced, that outbreaks are often conceptualized as waves. So it is also regarded as a kind of metaphorical expression. I should also explain the the theme in the fifth place, which is what I mean by race metaphor. Race can mean a lot of things, right? It has different denotations. And in our data set, actually what we mean is that because we found instances in which the development of vaccine is compared to a race against the virus or against other countries. And we can see that it accounts for only 13 instances, metaphorical expressions in total, which is significantly fewer than the ones on the top. For this reason, when we move on later on, when we discuss the actual examples, we will focus on the first top 3 themes, which is military metaphor, language metaphor, and natural world metaphor. And of course, this table only serves as an overview of the most common themes of COVID-related metaphors. And we will dig deeper into that, the specific mappings later on. And in our following statistics, the specific mappings are also highlighted according to these colors. So it's time to talk about the real, like the actual mappings. So these are the 10 most common mappings in the whole data set. This chart covered both languages together as well as the 4 genres. Each, as I have just mentioned, each color represents a certain theme, which is shared by more than one mapping. Here we can see that the substantial mapping under the themes we just talked about in the previous slide. So first of all, the green ones are military mappings, and it accounts for 4 mappings out of 10 here. We can observe that military metaphors are extensively presented in a diverse manner, with the focus on the first one, the pandemic as a war. While we can also see other mappings, for example, as an army, as an enemy, and it can construct a somewhat complete system of correspondence. So we have an army and an enemy in a war. You might also notice that in the 8th and 9th place, the 2 mappings are quite similar. This mapping here actually refers to the virus itself, and it is often found in explainer articles by newspaper outlets. And the latter the one below, refers to the pandemic in general. So this mapping can be used in a wide range of text. So we have made this distinction between the mappings when we are identifying the metaphorical correspondences in order to be specific enough in our analysis. And the yellow ones are what we call language-themed metaphors. And here we can see some specific mappings, including the second one, genetic material as language, and the one below, genetic material as a text. The language mapping here, the one on the top, would be the core of the language theme metaphors, while the latter is an extension of it. We can also see that from the number, it is the double of the one below. And here we have the blue one. I'm not sure if you remember what blue means, but the blue ones are actually the natural world metaphors, and we can see waves, volcanic eruptions, and trees as the source domains. And we can also see that the number are quite balanced. There are about 10, which might also suggest that, comparing to other themes, for example, the military theme and the language theme, it would be like what we would naturally put in the language. So colors aside, when we look at the table, it is quite obvious that the first 2 mappings really stand out in their figures, with 36 and 23. and which shows that they are really important when we are talking about COVID-19. We can also see other colors which signifies different themes of mapping when we dig deeper into the other statistics in the coming slides. We have more statistics, but it would show the difference between Chinese and English. So for this part, I will bring up some interesting points that I can find in the charts, and I will try to explain them later on in the discussion part. First of all, you might notice that there are generally more mappings when it comes to the English text, because I would like to just bring up, maybe it is due to one of the limitations of our project, that there is actually a slight imbalance in terms of the number between Chinese text and English text. So there are 20 Chinese text and 24 English text, but still we can see a pattern from these two tables. Apart from the first two mappings, when we compare the two tables, the rest of the figures are around 10, 5 to 10 or 4 to 10 for Chinese and 5 to 8 for English. And the second point is that we can see that the pandemic is a war in both languages. They come first in the table. So it really shows that it is essential to the both Chinese and English text. And apart from that, we can also see a general pattern. The good thing about labeling them with color is that we can see that in the English text, it is much more colorful than the one in Chinese text. So what does colorful actually mean? It means that the themes and the metaphor themes in the English text is more diverse comparing to the Chinese text. And you can also see that in the Chinese text, there are 4 green ones. Which is the military metaphors. So you can see that the focus in the Chinese text would be the military aspect of the pandemic. The last observation is that in the second place, you can see that for the Chinese text, the pandemic is a volcanic eruption, and it is almost non-existent in the English text. While in English text, the second place, the mapping in the second place is also almost non-existent in Chinese text, and that might actually, if we have to deduce it, maybe it is due to the phenomenon that there are some language-specific metaphors that maybe in English we tend to conceptualize something in terms of another thing, but in Chinese we do not. We have another way to present it. Okay, now that we have talked about the differences between the languages, we can also look at the differences between the government reports versus the press, the newspaper articles. In the data collection section, we talked about how government publications and newspaper articles do that in terms of metaphoricity, and we'll compare the two here. Just to give you a bit of the context, for government publications, we have 18 texts, while and sorry, it's another way around. We have 18 government publications and 14 government publications and 18 newspaper articles. So again, the press, the text related to the press is slightly more than that of the government. So regarding the differences between government reports and newspaper articles, there are also some interesting points. So generally, we can see that there is a larger variety in the press, and if we have to look at the number, we can see that it is more balanced in terms of number from 5 to 14, but in government publication is from 3 to 26. So, sorry. I would like to talk about the thing that I would like to talk about is that because in the government publications the range is quite large, we can see that in the first place, the mapping is quite important. It is again the military mapping. The pandemic is a war, and it might actually suggest that maybe in the government publications they have a different rhetorical goal. That's why they have to focus on the military mapping. And we can see that it has 27 occurrences, while the second mapping in the government publications are 11. So it's over a double of the second one. And there is also another observation here, which is the target domain. We can see that the pandemic is often conceptualized in another way in government publications. While in the press, maybe the protagonist, the focus will be different. We have the immune system, genetic materials, the pandemic, the coronavirus, all kinds of domains. But in government publications, it is a rather like monoscope, I would say. So maybe we are done with the statistics, and now maybe I can move on to the examples of the metaphorical expressions. So this one, if you are based in Hong Kong, I'm sure that you have come across it maybe from the start of the pandemic. And here we can also find a kind of metaphorical expression, one in the English text and one in Chinese. And here in English, we have together we fight the virus. So fighting is very straightforward. It is we are conceptualizing the whole pandemic control as a war, and also the virus as an enemy. While in the Chinese one, 同心抗疫, 抗疫 can actually mean that can be related to 抗战. So it's an other type of like military mapping as well. But the Chinese meaning is a bit different because it means a kind of resistance, resistance and war. So we have an outsider invading us, so we have to resist. And maybe the difference in terms of the slogan may contribute to, like maybe due to the cultural difference in Chinese and in English. And now we can move on to some other examples that maybe we have not come across. But they are, this one is actually from the press. Here we have the means of invasion. So here the coronavirus is portrayed as an enemy, is conceptualized as an enemy, that it is invading us. It has a kind of means to invade our immune system. It is a kind of personification. And in this example, we also have Putin declaring victory. And declaring victory would be regarded as a metaphor here, because the vaccine development is like a war against other country or maybe against the virus. It is rather ambiguous here, but we can also see that there is a pattern that we are using military metaphors. So for the Chinese examples, I have also provided a translation just for reference. So we can see that here it is a bit more complex. We have two metaphorical expressions, 抗疫與戰爭, fighting the epidemic like a war, and 戰況 is like the development in the battlefield. For the first one, it would be regarded as a direct metaphor. Just now in the methodology part, I mentioned that well, there are different metaphor categories. So what do I mean by direct metaphor? It is what we would traditionally call simile. So here is the use of signaling, metaphor signaling, which tells us that there is a kind of cross-domain mapping in play. And the second one, with battlefield, the development in the battlefield, scene form, we can see the mapping. The condemning is a war in which every country is a battlefield. In this example, the example below, it is also from the press. It is actually from Lecture Sunma, the explainer article from Lecture Sunma. So the target audience, the target readers would be the general public. So we have to also depict the how the vaccine works in a rather layman way, in an understandable way. So it's about how the vaccine works, and apart from the term that I've highlighted here, 武器, weapons, we can also see that there is a general picture. We have to look at the whole passage as a whole. So we can see that 有得消滅，有得捉拿，有得則記錄. Some destroy, some capture, and some recorded characteristics, and so on. We can actually form a picture in our minds that it is almost like an army with different teams of soldiers like fighting the virus. And in the language metaphors, we can also see some interesting example. In this one, we can see the term non-synonymous. Usually when we talk about synonyms, we would relate it to language, to words. But here, variants are depicted as words with synonyms and antonyms for the general readers to understand. Maybe it would be regarded as a metaphor as well. But at the same time, we can also observe that because the context of this part is a scientific research paper, and we can see that in terms of the scientific terminology, the role of metaphor is also important. Are the scientists thinking about genetics or about variants, pathology, in terms of language? In terms of how language works, it seems that the whole system of language has been adopted to explain how genetics work, and I will also explain it further in the following example. Here, the example is a bit different. It is actually the title of an explainer article in SCMP, local English newspaper. And here we can see that COVID-19 is conceptualized as a code, and that's why we have to decode it. We have to explain it. And for the Chinese examples, we can see that here is 校對機制 bank of 具有自己的校對機制 proofreading mechanism, and transcript deletion. These are also some kind of scientific terminology that is borrowed from the language domain. And here we can see that with the quotation mark, it is also another kind of metaphor signaling. And another observation is that usually when one language-themed metaphor is used, it is usually followed by another one. Here we have a proofreading mechanism, and then we have deletion. And usually they appear in the articles in cluster. And here in this example, we have found it translated. So translation is also another scientific terminology that is borrowed from the language domain. For the natural world metaphors, we have this example. So maybe you would think, wave, I've seen it before, but this, so why would I put it here to demonstrate? What do I have to say about it? It is actually quite an interesting combination because we have battle here and wave as well. So it is the combination of two domains, of two images. So is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Of course, the image is very rich, but is it kind of problematic? Because is it possible to battle the wave? It seems to me that it is impossible and even a bit discouraging, if you have to ask me. Just to give you the context, it is the title of one of the government reports. And in the second one, it seems the whole passage seems a bit intimidating because it is from a scientific research paper. But here we can see the word storm. Actually, it is a common term. Cytokine storm is also the common term of hypercyclotemia. So we can see that in this text, they have adopted a simpler term that is understandable, but comprehensible by the general readers, rather than using this term, this like more professional term. And here for the natural world metaphors, for the Chinese metaphor, it is quite a rich image because we have 火灾火種炎了 and fires, flame, and fuel. And it is quite a rich image. And interestingly, because there is a newspaper article and it actually coincided with the period when we saw a lot of wildfires in Australia and in California. So it has quite a strong communicative impact. But at the same time, is the communicative impact good or is it bad? We'll talk about it later on. But for this example, we also find some metaphor signaling with 類似同 are similar to. So it tells us that a cross-domain mapping is in play. And also the quotation mark is the same case. And by now, we might notice that in the Chinese text, there are a lot of signalings. Maybe it is a kind of language pattern or maybe not, but we still need further investigation. And for the next one, we have 濃霧 thick fog. So 濃霧彷彿遮蓋了前路. So the context of it is actually, it is one of the government reports again, and it is talking about how the pandemic have assaulted us, and the economy is in deep waters. So there is a thick fog obscuring the path ahead of us. So it is quite interesting because apart from the fog metaphor, we also have the journey metaphor here. It is, if I have to comment on it, it fits quite well because like the journey metaphor and the fog metaphor, they seems to be quite compatible and it creates quite a strong communicative impact. Okay, so now I will move on to the discussion part. So the first discussion point, I have some observation about the Chinese and English text. So when we go back to the table, we can see that in general there are more metaphorical expressions in English text than in Chinese text. So I would like to explain a bit. It is just my suggestion. So because in our project, it involves government publications, and in Hong Kong, usually the government publications are bilingual. We have the English and Chinese versions. So we can actually compare the two. Of course, this is not a translation analysis. We don't know which one is the source text, which one is the target text, but we can observe some differences between the two. Because generally in the government publications, there are fewer metaphorical expressions identified. But at the same time, many of them are found to be expressed as Chinese idioms. That might be due to another limitation because we are using MIP in the methodology. We talked about MIP, and how do we come up with a basic sense of the words? We would have to check it in the dictionary, and when the dictionaries have the whole entry of the idiom, it would definitely show as the basic sense. So I would say that it would be a kind of limitation when we have to use the tool MIP. But still, it contributes to the range of entailments and imagery. And why would I say that? Because I can see that the authors tend to use idioms that are of the same themes, of the same metaphor themes. So, for example, for the wave metaphor, we can see 來勢洶洶 and 一波未平一波又起. And 來勢洶洶 actually means that they are coming on full fury, or literally like massive waves. And 一波未平一波又起 means that hardly has one wave subsided when another one arises. So we can see that maybe the wave metaphor is also extended, also impacts the voice, the choice of diction when the author is planning which kind of idiom or what kind of language they decide to use in the text. And the second observation is that because maybe we can go back to the government and the press. Because generally we can see that like in the government publications, they focus a lot on the pandemic, while in the press there are more different kind of domains that is conceptualized. And that's what I would like to explain here in the discussion, in the observation too. So what I would suggest is that because the nature of the metaphorical expressions in the government and in the press are different. Of course, it would be natural because the rhetorical goal of the text are different. So we can see, apart from the difference in mapping, we can also see the differences in the textual patterning. For the government publications, most of the metaphors are found in the first and last paragraph. So what are the first and the last paragraph? They're actually the introduction and the conclusion. So maybe because government reports, for the government reports, the introduction and conclusion would really speak to us, would really call for action to mobilize people. So that's why we can find that kind of metaphorical expressions, and that's also why the mappings are kind of like monoscopic. And for the newspaper articles, we also find that the textual patterning is different. They are widely spread in various sections of the article. For example, in the explainer article, maybe we can find that there are clusters too, but basically the pattern is not as outstanding as the one in government publications. So to conclude this slide, because there are different attributes of different types of text, the objective of newspaper articles is to explain and to report, while the objective of government publication is to mobilize, to call for action, to ask people to take actions, or to explain the rationale behind their policies. With different rhetorical goals, there will be different patterns and mappings. And the third observation, which is the final observation, is the correlation between the key methods. Because we can see that after all the content we've talked about, we can see that how the pandemic has been conceptualized. It has been conceptualized as an aggressor. For example, we can see violent images like war, fire, volcanic eruptions, and they are all kind of aggressive or violent images. At the same time, we can think about the compatibility. Just now we talked about how battle and waves are not compatible, and they actually create a kind of conflicted image of the epidemic as well. For example, when we think about the fire metaphors, it is kind of uncontrollable, and it is an illusion to wildfires, and it is somewhat discouraging and maybe lead to fatalism as well. But for the war metaphor, military metaphor, it is a call for action. It is to mobilize people. Would it be a conflicted image? Create a conflicted image about the epidemic? And the second point I would like to talk about is the partial nature of metaphorical entailment. Because the target domains and the source domains are not really equivalent. It's just like translation. The source text and the target text cannot be equivalent, right? So we can see that maybe there are something that about the war metaphor that is not compatible with the pandemic in general. For example, the war metaphor foregrounds the need for action, but in the earlier stage of the epidemic, the government actually asked us to be like self-restraint would be of utmost importance to control the spread, right? So is it calling for action or inaction? And also we can find that in the previous example, when Putin declared victory with the development of the jab, is it really a kind of victory moment? We can now see that the jab might not be as effective as we might have thought, and is that regarded as a kind of victory? I would say maybe no, but maybe it's just a victory in a small battle. And also for the third point, it is about the shifting narrative of the government, because we are 18 months into this pandemic, and it is inevitable that the government would change the narrative and the policies as well. We can see that in a lot of countries over the world, the leaders are calling for coexistence with the coronavirus. But at the beginning, they actually used the military metaphor, and the coronavirus is portrayed as an aggressor. Would it be kind of contradictory? Are we asked to coexist with an aggressor or with an enemy? And of course, in Hong Kong, it is kind of different, because the government is calling for the zero, is seeking the zero COVID strategy. But at the same time, the military narrative will become less convincing when the people look at the statistics, and they can see maybe there are 0 local cases in Hong Kong, while the government is still holding on to the military metaphor, or still holding on to the strict COVID rules. So with this kind of observation, they would notice that it is not aligned with the government relative. The reality and the narrative are kind of different. So the communicative impact of the metaphors will become less convincing. And to wrap up the whole presentation, I would like to bring up 3 points, which is, first of all, we can see that metaphor is essential to COVID-19 publications in both Chinese and English across different genres. And the second point is that they can actually influence the choice of words or the diction, and it can impact the readers in the communicative aspect. And the third point is that military metaphor or the depiction of the coronavirus as an aggressor in general, as an enemy that we have to fight. It is quite prevalent in all kinds of genres and across the two languages. And it would, because we're not expecting the pandemic is going to end very soon, and we can also anticipate some future development of the discourse, and maybe we can also notice other kind of metaphors and how they develop when time goes by. But for now, that's a wrap, and thank you so much.
What kind of references
All right, great. Thanks very much. A very, very interesting presentation, touching upon very, very important and interesting issues. So it's like if you'd like to ask questions arising from the presentation, could you please press the button? Those of you attending first seminar by Zoom, could you please press the button, the icon, raise hand, and we'll unmute your box. So, great. Any questions?
So those online certificates out there.
Okay, we've got the question here in first room. Yes, yes, sure. Go ahead, please.
This is probably a question because I can see that your research is very well done.
Thank you so
I
much.
just have two maybe suggestions. Okay, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Andy. I used to teach at Leung University. Now I'm with Xuyan. Yeah. And one is because I can see that you show a poster in the third beginning. I forgot it's for the third slide or the fourth slide. And in recent years, probably not, it happens for a decade or so, the intersectional translation. So my suggestion is, have you considered, say, visual metaphors? Because I can see that, sometimes you say T-shape, a picture's worth 1,000 words, or nowadays a post, on Instagram is worth 1,000 words. So have you considered this, or is this something you may like to do, or what's your view on this?
Well, maybe I will take the question. First of all, thank you so much, Andy, for your question, and thank you so much for coming in to listen to the presentation. And for the what you have talked about is actually called multimodal metaphor.
Right.
Yeah, and to be honest, at the first at the initial stage of the project, we only targeted at the linguistic metaphors. But as I was doing the research and data collection, I also noticed that maybe it's worth to talk about this. We can also talk about other visual images and maybe the post on social media, and that would definitely be the future direction if we have to take this on. But that's a good point, and we are considering that as well. But for this part, at this stage, we're just focusing on the linguistic metaphors, because there is a wide range of text that we can focus on as well.
I'm not dominating this. I have one more short question. Is I noticed that those publicity materials related to COVID-19 has also been translated into, say, Tagalog, Indonesian Bahasa. So because I'm not, I'm not familiar with those languages, but this is a very interesting direction for the development of linguistic community in Hong Kong, because especially the Indian community, Pakistani community, is growing, very fast. So, so what is your view on this? Because COVID-19 is not just about the Chinese community and the expats, the English-speaking communities. Probably you know that a lot of Pakistani, they're elderly and they don't really speak English. Okay, the younger generation, they speak Cantonese, but they can't really read Chinese. So what's your view, or is there something you can pursue?
Thanks for the question. Thanks very much. I mean, obviously, this is to get a complete picture. One would want to look at least, well, all of those languages, really. But I suppose that the main thing that hampers us is the lack of linguistic expertise.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's obviously the
problem. Also,
but it will make
of documents have been translated because of the limited budget.
Sure.
Something because now I'm working part-time in the Xuyan. One thing I want to say, raise the awareness of their linguistic rights. Yeah, so since the government doesn't have the budget, to translate everything related to COVID-19, just a few leaflets I can, find in the Home Office department in my district. So probably they are at a disadvantage in COVID-19 because usually most of them are not from the richest sector of our community.
Well, I mean,
linguistic wise.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, it would make a very fascinating contrastive study. I mean, yeah, definitely help us complete the picture.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I've got two responses. Let me just read out the first one. Very interesting topic. Any theoretical framework can be established on the basis of the study's findings. So the question is it possible to construct a theoretical framework on the basis of the findings? End quote. Any thoughts about
I mean, thanks very much for that question. We haven't really been thinking in those terms. Grace explained the theoretical frameworks that we use. We haven't as yet attempted to add to those or enrich them in any way. I think one of the things that Grace mentioned a couple of times was narratives. So possibly if we were to expand and extend the project, then that might be quite interesting. The interplay between metaphors and narrative construction, I think that would be a potential contribution of the study. I don't know, Grace, would you have something to add or? Okay, sure.
Thanks very much. We've got another question. This question is about metaphor adaptation. Why do you use MIT and MITBU together?
Maybe I did talk about a bit about it in the methodology. So for MIP, it is actually the initial version of MIPFU, and there are still some points that are not quite clear or can be expanded. So we have also adopted MIPFU for the addition of different metaphor categories, which I find compatible to the corpus in our project. And that's why we have it together. Of course, MIP is the basis, while MIPFU is the extension of it.
All right. Okay. Thanks very much.
No, nothing to add. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Any other questions? So, yes.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? Right.
Oh yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Oh yes, yeah. Thank Grace and Mark. It's a very interesting presentation. Right, this is a very first time for me to hear about this methodology MIP. So I'm just well, just to follow up the previous questions, right? So is this just an emerging methodology, or just it is just has a lot to do with the more emerging IT technology, the database? So that means it is very much technology based. So moreover, I'm wondering about the penetration of this methodology at national, that is even at mainland level or at international level. So it is how popular is this methodology in this field or in other field? So would you like to? I'm very interested in this methodology, and I want to know more about it. So if it is convenient, can you say a few words more about it? Right. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Like by methodology, I think you mean that like, because we have mentioned the three pillars. The first one is like metaphor identification, and for metaphor identification, MIP and MIPFU are quite the most well-known procedure when it comes. Of course, it would be after 2007 because it was established in 2007. But before that, and a long time ago, people only use intuition to identify the metaphors. So with MIP and the extended version MIPFU, it would put forward a more systematic framework. Of course, intuition is still in play. We have to use intuition to determine whether there is basic meaning, but it would be like a more systematic way for us to identify them. And for the parameters, it would be it has been applied in several studies. Well, maybe in Mark's recent publication, it is also applied, but his version was a more elaborate version with 6 parameters, if I am not mistaken. So it is also adopted, the same methodology is also adopted in the coming publications as well. So I would say that, yes, we have adopted the most well-known or something that maybe people have done before in our research.
Maybe actually, just quickly, if I might add, thank you for the question. They're possibly not all that technology based MIP and MIPFU, because I mean they can be applied just using paper dictionaries basically, and the researcher's own intuition. It's not they're not dependent on the use of a sort of electronic corpus or anything like that. Although they could work in conjunction with that certainly.
Thanks very much for the follow-up question. Could you please make it clearer by giving some examples to show that MIT can't solve some cases on identification procedure, and therefore return to MIT. Any examples? You can just that first.
Maybe I will elaborate a bit more on that. Actually, I would say that MIP is applicable in most cases, in nearly all of the cases in our research. But we have also used the list of metaphor categories, which involves indirect metaphor, direct metaphor, implicit metaphor, metaphor flags, especially in combination with textual patterning analysis, that can show us some nuances within the text, and I'm not sure if it answered your question, but that's about it.
Thanks very much. We'll take first into Sarah, and then we'll pass to the chat box. Got two more questions there.
Thanks very much, Grace and Mark, for a very, very interesting and I think a timely research project. Actually, my question, it's not exactly questions, but two observations to share with you. One of them is that I noticed that in your reference list, there is also this classic book from Leung and Johnson, saying metaphors we live by. So like metaphor is a fundamental mechanism of mind, so we use it consciously and subconsciously. And at the beginning, Mark also explained, like introduced that we use metaphors in all sorts of discourses. So from your analysis, I wonder if you noticed any prominent qualitatively or quantitatively the use of metaphors in a specific pandemic context or discourse versus the use of metaphors in other discourses or contexts, and how it stands out more in comparison to other the use of metaphors in other discourses. Actually, I have two questions, but I'll just ask that one.
We're not sure.
Yeah, it might be out of the scope of the project. It's just.
I mean, it's a really good question, and obviously that would be a fascinating study, but there hasn't really been a comparative component to our study. But I mean, I don't know if we talk in terms of impression. I mean, you've looked in more detail at the text. Would your impression be that some of them are very metaphor rich?
I am not sure as well. So I believe that a more in-depth contrastive study would be necessary. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. We've got another question. First one about the significance of your study. Could you please elaborate on the significance of your study, especially for those policymakers, those studying metaphors? What can be the take home to them? What is the biggest insight you might share with these group of people?
For policymakers, are there any suggestions, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the communicative aspect, I would say that maybe as a pandemic develops, we should rethink about what kind of metaphors we have to use to conceptualize the pandemics or different aspects of the pandemics in order to be realistic. For example, if we still talk about the pandemic in Hong Kong, the pandemic situation as a whole, is it realistic or is it not? Is it convincing? And it can actually be detrimental to the military metaphor. It is like a two-way relationship. In the future, maybe we have some other important crisis that we want to go to the military metaphor again. The communicative impact would be less convincing. It would be like the people would not take it simply.
Could I add a word or two? Thanks very much. And thank you for the question. And it seems to me it would be interesting to know the extent to which the use of metaphor by policymakers who are behind the text was actually deliberate. Are they adopting this as an intentional communication strategy, or is this just sort of natural, perhaps not so self-aware language usage on their part? But that would be quite interesting to probe, because obviously, you know, metaphors could be deliberately planted and developed to put across particular messages. I mean, that image of the two children, I think that's been quite deliberately constructed. But apart from that, you know, there's not a lot of evidence of deliberate use, I don't think, or maybe, I don't know, maybe you disagree.
I do agree on that.
Okay, thanks very much. We've got another question about software. Is there software that can be used for metaphor identification, or you have to use the identification manually?
Shall I take this one? I mean, I think there are experimental systems, but you can't reliably identify metaphors in text. You can get some way by looking at the keenness of particular words, and ones with a high keenness score might stand, they might stand out simply because they are from a different domain. A text about an epidemic, and then suddenly there are words to do with warfare. So one would expect a number of metaphorical expressions to be somehow characteristic of that text. But there's not a sort of 100% reliable way of identifying metaphors in text, not yet anyway. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Thanks very much. Another question. The question is there any potential application of first metaphor study to translation or interpreting of COVID-19 related texts? For example, the Hong Kong government reports are usually bilingual, as just mentioned. I'm not sure if they usually have the Chinese texts first and then translated into English. If they do, I wonder if the project has touched upon any difference of metaphor uses in the source and target texts, and implications for translation or interpreting to do with COVID-19 issues.
Actually, we have indeed think about it when we are doing the data collection, because when we are researching, like looking for the governmental publications, you're right that there are bilingual versions. But at the same time, because we're not sure which one comes first, which one is the translated version, and there is kind of limitation here, and it would actually limit the scope of the whole project to government publications, because in the current presentation we covers like scientific research paper as well as the newspaper articles, and it would be rather difficult for us to expand the scope if we have to like find out how they are translated, how metaphors are translated. But if we are looking at different type of text, for example, Mark's research on the Scientific American, it is a popular science magazine, and there are certain, like there are different languages, different versions, and it would be worth of like the translation aspect would be very fruitful indeed.
Thanks very much. I think that's great. That's what the question.
Yeah, I've got a question. Thanks very much for the excellent presentation. I've got a curiosity. If we reach out to the whole Chinese community when we portray COVID-19 or fight against COVID-19, whether they show the same pattern, I mean, by having the same military metaphor among the whole Chinese community. And after, but nowadays, like days ago, I heard that Singaporean president has advocated a strategy of coexisting with the coronavirus. And you said that Hong Kong government is still keeps using the military method nowadays. I'm not sure whether it is under the influence of the central government, or it is just like what the Mark has said. It's like a deliberate say advertising campaign or something like that. So I'm not sure if the whole Chinese community is using the same military metaphor during the COVID-19 combat. Yeah.
Actually, because of our limitation of this research project, we only focused on the Hong Kong text, but it is also an interesting point that we can look at the Sinophone region to compare different like metaphors used in the text. And that's a good point. Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Just a follow-up, it's actually relevant to the previous question. I'm curious about the influence of culture on the selection, on the deliberation of the metaphors. So if we do not extend the scope to the Greater China area or the Sinophone sphere, but just looking at Hong Kong, obviously, as you mentioned, the texts are bilingual with that's the idea of which one is the source, which one is the target. Nevertheless, culture plays a significant role in shaping of the language. I wonder, for example, this use of metaphors, a military metaphor. There's no food metaphor. I love to talk about food, but so I just wondered if you have any ideas, insights on the influence of culture on the use of metaphor in this, especially like the military metaphor. I don't really see that very often in, for example, Australian COVID discourse, the British COVID calls discourse.
I mean, I've just taken a look at the lists of the statistics that Grace produced, and none of them are sort of deeply embedded in Chinese or Hong Kong culture. It's military metaphors, language metaphors, metaphors from the natural world, and so on. So I don't think we see much of that based on those lists. But I mean, you've looked at the data in greater detail. I mean, would you say that was a fair observation, or would you want to?
Because the limitation with us producing a table is that there are certain bits below. Maybe there is just only one occurrence or two occurrences that are missed out in the presentation. And for your point, I have never looked at the data in that way, so maybe I have to go back to look at it again. But maybe if you're talking about the cultural differences, like just now I mentioned that together we fight the virus and 同心抗疫, 同心抗疫. And maybe we can see that even within the military mappings, we can see the different details that we are looking at the war as like a different, maybe in the English we have to be proactive, while in the English, while in the Chinese language, it's more like someone invaded us, so we have to resist. Maybe it's also due to the cultural difference, their view on the natural world. I'm not sure if it answered your question, but that's worth of a thought. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any other questions? No, but I've got actually an observation to share, not really a question. I think this is a very, very interesting presentation, touching on some very, very important issues. I think that one of the most important findings to emerge from the presentation that the metaphorical use of language is ideologically inflected. Example, Putin's use of tempest is very, very excellent. So I wonder if it's possible to identify the type of uses of metaphor, tropes and metaphors that counteract the dominant version of this military imagery. I mean, Ray touched upon when he suggested that perhaps the comparison can be made between the military metaphor and there's this idea of coexistence of the other. So I know this is not your focus. I mean, this doesn't fall in to, for example, to look at literary texts and see how the pandemic is understood, perhaps using different tropes, different figures, different methods. I mean, just one observation.
Yeah, actually, because in our research, I did look at some literary texts as well, and there are some interesting images that we can find. For example, we are human beings are conceptualized as fish, and the world is like the world we are in with the pandemic. It's like the ocean. So it's kind of like, but it's kind of like suffocating the fish. I'm not sure whether it is appropriate or not, and I would have to go back to like look at the text as well. But you're right that there are some creative input from the literary community about COVID-19 metaphors.
Yeah, thanks very much. Any other questions? Well, can I just ask another question? I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, when you talk about the difficulty with identifying metaphors, the conceptual metaphors. So, I wonder if it's to do with the fact that some metaphors are just dead. I mean, they are not recognized as metaphors such. I mean, that they're no longer understood as metaphors. I mean, these are just very common everyday expressions they use almost without thinking about the literal meaning. So I mean these are dead metaphors.
Yeah.
I mean, and thoughts.
So I know. You want to? So yeah, yes. I mean, I think. Dead metaphor is usually included in the concept or the remit of ambit rather of conceptual metaphor, but it's at one end of the scale, and the other end of the scale, of course, is the creative metaphor. But they can both be sanctioned by the same mapping. I would struggle to think of an example off the top of my head, but this is, it's a fairly well established fact in metaphor studies. Some metaphors, as you say, are so dead, or relatively speaking, highly lexicalized, that we don't really notice them. But still, I mean, like I suppose, like the word wave. So that's entirely dead. But it's very, very lexicalized. And we don't particularly notice its use, but possibly the other one you referred to, which is about the something about the waves, the waterfall. Which I looked up while you were speaking, but that would be perhaps more creative, or possibly not. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but a whole range of different metaphorical expressions can be related back to a conceptual metaphor. Anything to add?
Interesting. I mean, you think of all those methods in terms of perspective. So at one end of the dead method, non-recognized and then at the other end you have very, very great use of language. For example, in literary text you just mentioned, fish being surrounded by water and so on and so forth. I mean, it is actually possible to conceptualize the different varieties in terms of perspective. Great, good. Okay, any other questions? All right, I think that we've got one. I think we've got one more question. Right. The question is, my question is about the metaphor adaptation and the mapping process. I wonder, is there
any existing lexicon that you refer to when identifying the metaphors and mapping, or do you come up with those categories by yourself? Slightly technical. Do you want me to repeat the question? The question is about metaphor identification and mapping process. Is there any existing lexicon that you refer to when identifying the metaphors and mapping? Would you come up with those categories by yourself?
Categories. I'm not sure. Does it mean parameters or the themes?
I mean, the way I understand the question, if I may, thanks for the question. I mean, there are some lists of conceptual metaphors. There are 2 or 3 of these in existence. In fact, there's one called Metalu that was created by researchers in Leung about 20 years ago. Andrew Berkeley, of course. No, we didn't refer to any lists of conceptual metaphors. So when you say, well, the categories, did we come up with the categories ourselves? I assume there you mean the conceptual metaphors, the mappings. And I think we did. We came up with them ourselves, or rather, Grace came up with them herself.
But with reference to the Goldlee's research, his tool that is available online, as well as the master metaphor list.
Right. Right, thanks very much. Any other questions? If not, then let me just say thank you again to the 2 speakers today for very interesting presentation.
I think am I right when I say it's the first seminar of this kind you actually?
Yeah, I'm so happy that you've given me the opportunity to speak.
Well,
to present the findings.
Not at all. I mean, your findings are just absolutely fascinating. You should be congratulated on the research that you conducted, and you can see from the obviously, you know, I'm there to support you in that, of course. But the fact that there were so many questions, that's sort of testimony to the interest that your research has aroused.
Thank you so much. And the idea actually comes from Mark, so yeah.
Well, it comes from someone else originally, but I may be one link in the chain.
Exactly what I was going to say. It's very provocative. I mean, so many questions, and I mean, from so many different perspectives.
Thank you.
Good. Well done. Congratulations. And also thanks for your contributions to the discussion. Thanks very much.